this is the Human Native Leader, a series of conversations with leaders who are rethinking what it means to lead a team while AI changes how work actually gets done. My guest today is Abhishek Dhasmana, VP of Products at Fanatics. He's in the middle of what a lot of tech leaders are wrestling with right now, figuring out how to move fast on AI without losing what makes his teams good at their jobs. Abhishek, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Great. So, maybe you can start by just, setting the scene for us here. Can you describe your scope at Fanatics and what have you been focused on over the past 12 to 18 months?
Sure. So I have dual role at Fanatics. One that you already sort of spoke in the introduction, which is VP of product for our AI platform. The other role is the general manager of our India Tech Center. I joined Fanatics about 16 months ago. And at the time, we were about 200 odd people, and we are at about 340. So that's from a number perspective in terms of sort of how we've grown in the last 16 months. But within that number, we've hired a lot more leaders to lead teams independently from India. So that's the context of sort of from a general manager responsibilities that I have. When we got introduced to rising teams, I think a few problems that I personally was sort of also looking to solve for was, we've been getting great talent from different companies, and they all come with their own perspective on what's the right thing to do. So one problem is that, like, how do you go and quickly create a common culture that's not just there like in writing and you can sort of memorize it and say, oh, here are the 4 values of our companies, but to be able to live it and to exercise it and to practice it, and so that we all sort of have a common way of applying sort of those principles and values. And traditionally it's been a hard thing to do because most of the times it'll be a one-off thing. You'll talk about, okay, here are the 4 values of our company, but ultimately you'll just learn it as a manager, as a leader. You'll learn it either through an annual performance sort of process, or just when you're in a situation. And when you're in a situation, you tend to fall back on your past experiences, and then you try to sort of apply what you've learned in the past. So I mean, nothing wrong with that. It's just that it's a little bit inconsistent, and I was hearing it a little bit as I sort of came in that everybody's got right intentions, but there is difference in how people are applying that. So yeah, I really wanted to bring the team together and have sort of shared set of values that are applied consistently.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense in such a high growth environment, bringing new team members on and trying to develop just a common culture, as well. So you'd mentioned, a lot of times in the past you rely on, a new team member just getting, kind of acclimated and kind of immersed in the culture over time, learning from other team members. From a, manager development perspective, right? You're also hiring kind of managers and team leaders. That's kind of another skill, right, that you hire for, but also want to develop. What have you seen work in the past? What have you kind of relied on from a management development perspective?
Yeah, it's a tough one. Especially for first time managers, I think they just have it very hard because they just need to make this transition from like being a super solid individual contributor, and then there's this sort of age old saying of what got you here is not going to take you further, right? So I think it's just like first time managers are especially hard, and then if you are a younger manager, like even if you're coming from a different company, and then trying to settle down. So in the past, I think we've had very few HR driven programmatic interventions that will happen once a year or at most sort of twice a year. But then there's a huge gap in the middle where it's essentially left to the manager to seek help, right? So the onus is on the manager. So they could go and talk to their peers. They could go and approach the HR, their senior leaders. But then if you are a new person in a company, then it's especially hard because you don't have sort of a trusted network, right? Like you want to discuss things that are not easy to discuss in a new sort of environment, right? So my experience has been that most people will just not reach out and seek help, and they will just get by with what is common sense. And even if sort of they do reach out, they'll probably get some advice, and then but then it'll be a little bit inconsistent in how it's applied. So I haven't had a really good sort of tool that would work at scale in the past.
Yeah, yeah, no, I can certainly appreciate that. What, as the, organization leader, then what's the cost to you of that? Is it, you have some managers who are trained up, others who are not. There's kind of the inconsistency. What does that kind of feel like from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think it eventually shows up in what we would loosely describe as culture, and the reflection of that would be typically in an annual sort of well-being survey, that almost all companies that are good would do, right? And you'd see the same patterns where there is inconsistency in pockets, and the problem is more acute when you are a remote development center, let's say in a country like India, if the mothership, let's say, is in the US, right? So, because there are natural sort of friction points of time zone, and even sort of cultural differences in how, because ultimately managing people is about managing people and understanding their context and culture, right? So, even if the value is the same, how you apply that value in a different cultural context is different. So, it just would be like a long process. So that's sort of one cost, which is it would take people time to literally figure out, what the common culture of a company is. And then I think one of the sort of after effects of that is that many a time you don't really understand what the real problem is, and you're trying to fix it piecemeal based on what you hear in an annual survey, etc. So um, yeah, it's just tough. There's no other, like traditionally, there's in my experience there's been no other way but to be in that setup for a longish amount of time, before you really get a hang of how to apply it consistently.
Yeah, so this becomes kind of looking for a way to almost accelerate that, because this, especially in this environment, right? Time is of the essence, on so many fronts.
200%. Even in last 6 months, in how AI has accelerated the rate at which we are, producing software or producing business results, or the expectation of producing it. It's really sort of almost impossible to imagine that, you would take in the order of years to go and have that consistent application of principles in your leadership. So for sure, that's not going to work.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So you had mentioned before then, as you've been building the team, right, infusing kind of the bold principles, and culture across the team was so important. What's so important about that? Like what does that, unlock and enable you to do?
Yeah. So for I mean, BOLD is essentially an acronym for our four sort of values, which basically mean building championship team, being obsessed with fans, demonstrating limitless entrepreneurship, and then being determined and relentless. And at Fanatics, it's not just sort of a value system that's there on a piece of wall and we sort of talk about it, but actually it's part of our performance management process, that we would evaluate people not only on the what, which is the results that they achieved, but also how. And these four sort of principles are our rubric for evaluating people on the how. So the first thing is that everybody needs to understand, this is not just thing to be taken lightly, that it's some principle and at some point you can just say whether you sort of lived it or not. Like you literally will be evaluated on that. And then once people understand that, then it just by definition means that it has to be applied consistently. People really need to understand, what these principles are and how sort of they'll be evaluated, and which is where, um, again, we come back to the same thing, which is like pick anyone, builds championship teams. What does it mean? And a lot of it is situational, which is again, how does a manager sort of apply that principle or that value system to, let's say, somebody who's just out of college, to somebody who's been there for 10 years, right? And again, the consistency is super important. Otherwise, people will rightfully feel that it's inconsistent and unfair, and then it just causes sort of more discontentment in the team.
Yeah. So it's driving kind of consistency across the team from a management, but also just team member experience perspective. It sounds like.
Right. And once you have that shared rubric, it's also um, easy to see your behaviors from those four lenses and say, like whether you're a manager and you're trying to sort of coach, a person who reports into you to say, hey, here's what it means to be obsessed with fans, right? And if you are working on a product that has external customers, then sort of it's easy. But if you're working on an internal tool where your stakeholders and your users are internal users, right? So then like, oh, they are your fans, right? So again, having that common language um, also helps create that consistency on how do I apply the same principles to different contexts inside the organization.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Uh, and as you think about, so your team is working with other kind of global teams as well. How does that help just with teaming kind of across the broader organization at Fanatics?
Yeah, like working with other teams is sort of is just part of the role definition. And yeah, like again, we come back to, so how do you collaborate with the teams, right? So in some cases, well, ideally in all cases, there's always a win-win, right? But it's human to sort of, in certain sort of situations to think like, you know, let me do this more for my team, right? But then that's where we'll sort of pull it back into Bill's championship team and say, no, the short term sort of optimization for, if Fanatics is going to lose, nobody is going to win, right? So drilling that principle down by way of examples, because they are real situations where the answer is not that obvious, and helping people understand that through not just sort of stated principle, but also how people apply that in difficult situations. And like I said, cross team, across cultures, across time zones, it is hard. It is hard, and different companies operate differently, and there's a different way to succeed in each organization. And therefore, like I said in my opening sort of context description, since we are bringing in people from different organizations, they are likely to apply it differently based on what they've learned in their previous organization.
Right. Right. Yeah. So bringing it back kind of and making sure that it's applied in the right context for you
Yeah, and
all.
the other thing sort of comes to mind is the prisoner's dilemma, right? Which is, if both of you are going to cooperate, the outcome is going to be better. But then the classical prisoner's dilemma is that if there is no built-in trust, you are more likely to take a decision that is going to be optimal for you, but like suboptimal for the larger group.
Yeah. So yeah, infusing that team value then.
Right.
Certainly. You were exploring the Rising Team solution, with the team, and walk me through kind of what you were thinking about at that time. What were you kind of looking for and evaluating?
Yeah. I think there's a few things that we were looking for. One was like just a more structured way in which we could just um, enable managers and teams to understand the principles, but also have a space where they can first get to know each other. So again, in the past, how one gets assimilated into a team is just largely dependent on whether you're lucky to get into a group with a good manager, because they've figured it out that there's a human side, or they will actually, the manager would try to personalize their leadership style to different individuals. But the tool sort of gave like really good kids, as sort of Rising Team calls it. And when we did a pilot of it, it immediately became obvious that, this kind of on rails experience um, just removes that friction of creativity from the manager's head. And it just gives you sort of an on rails experience of, hey, how do you go in and engage with your team. And the variety of kits that we saw, again through a sampling of a lot of seasoned managers, it looked like it incorporated a lot of best practices. So I think that was really great. Two was, I think the control was with the manager herself or himself, where they could go and initiate it at a time, versus, like I was saying, in the absence of such a tool, you're essentially dependent on, let's say, when the HR team or anybody in the company is just doing that session. And if you are on leave that week, then you sort of lose it. So I think those two things were really great. And third thing that at the time I think Rising Team was working on was this AI bot called RT, which could give more um, more avenues for a person, especially for managers, to discuss, like, quote unquote difficult issues, right? So it, we've all had sort of those experiences where, how does one have difficult conversations, and again, in the past, people just learn on the job. I mean, either you're naturally good at it, or you just are learning on the job. You make many mistakes over multiple years. And one thing that was really promising was uh, the promise of using AI to do that role play session, and that was also a very interesting.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, it sounds like it's like like you were describing, kind of the team-based aspect of actually being able, the manager kind of having a playbook to run kind of with their team, and creating that safe space. And you had mentioned this earlier too, right? Like, new managers aren't necessarily going to raise their hand, to address an issue. They might try to solve it themselves. So this
Yeah,
kind of creates a new safe space for them as
absolutely,
well. So,
absolutely. Yeah, and I think that the space at which we work at Fanatics is like so fast that there's practically very little time for you to sort of take a breather and say, you know what, let me do ABC. So therefore, it's just so helpful to have a tool which will make it super easy for you to to connect with your team and understand their issues, or just do self learning and development. So it's even more useful for us.
yeah, tell me about that, right? Your teams are, working hard, very fast paced, right? It's hard to carve out, time, for management development, for team development. But how does this kind of change the game for you?
Yeah, I think the two or three big game changers are, like I said, just this out of the box kits that have different topics and are really easy to get started with. So for example, like there's a working styles kit, or even something as informal as a person that really inspired you, or one of the most embarrassing moments, right? So they all look very simple, and sometimes you know uh, slightly even irrelevant, but all season managers know, right? Like once people start to talk about their personal experiences, it just creates that space where you know the other team members will open up to each other. So that's where we've heard most positive feedback around, like, oh, the first session that I did with my team really helped me learn about my team members. And this is true even for teams where they've been working with each other for a reasonably long amount of time, right? So, um, and your appreciation for the other individual's context or what they've learned, right? Or, I mean, I think nothing works like two people having a shared context, whether they were in a same place, or they had the same experience, or they came up with the same solution, etc., or they have the same hero or whatever, right? um, so it really like helps with that. And then the second thing where this is helping is, like I said, it's the control is in your hand of when you want to do it. So, and this has happened multiple times, which is, oh, not all team members are available this week. No worries, we'll do it next week. Oh, somebody fell sick. No worries, we'll do it the week after. So there's no, it's like you don't really miss out and you can plan it. And each team, right? Like, so that's the other thing. Traditionally, you do these trainings at the same time for a large number of groups, but then each group has their own deadlines, their business context is very different, so therefore you'd always, like, you'd be lucky if 50% of people show up, because, and not because they
Right.
don't want to do it, right? It's just that their business context does not allow them to come together at the same time. So that has been really, really good. And the third thing that um, is working well is that individual safe space with the AI bot, where they can, especially managers, actually it's true for both managers and for team members, right? You are getting into an annual performance review, right? Like, both from the manager side, they want to land, there are great things and there are some things that they want to land on their sort of reportee, and the other side as well. The other side, like, as an employee, you want to tell the best things that you did, and many people who are not very articulate, would struggle with it. They'll probably not be able to express, the things that they did. So, yeah, like, that role playing is also, I think, very valuable.
Awesome. And so I know you're still kind of, early in your journey here. But what are you kind of seeing from both managers and team members so far?
Yeah, with managers, I think we have like a really good engagement rate. 2 months into it, about 66% of our managers are not only engaged, but they've had more than 5 exchanges with the AI trainer. They also, I think, 95% of them are return users as well, which means that it's not a one-off thing. They are sort of coming back to it, and I think that, like with many things AI, it's going to take a little bit where it'll become your default muscle memory to say, "Oh, I have a problem. Let me just discuss it with my personal AI trainer." So we'll see how that unfolds.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. But that's exciting to see, the usage so far. You're also just broadly right in this growth mode and build mode, right, of the India Tech Center. How does this tool kind of like fit in as you're growing and building the team?
I think there's two parts to it. One is, like we said, which is, as we continue to grow, like, so learning or onboarding new people is not a one-time process if you're growing, right? So more people come in, and it just becomes um, a standard way of how people not only sort of onboard to onto Fanatics, but like quickly learn the culture and the application of it. So in that sense, it's an ongoing um, help. Um, the other thing is that as AI learns about people's individual preferences, they learn, like, the AI learns the context of a specific individual. I'm hoping that it becomes more and more effective in giving not just general sort of solutions, but actually very personalized solutions, because now it has context about a person, what they are good at, what they're still sort of working at. So those two things, I'm really sort of hoping the tool will help in making a really strong sort of remote development center like ours.
Yeah, that's so true. The personalization aspect, right? Providing kind of advice that's not just generic, but actually specific to the person, their
Right.
context, right, is really kind of what makes things land.
Yeah.
So yeah, that certainly resonates. As you're thinking about kind of like other VPs of, product leaders of other tech centers who are, you know, all in maybe on AI tooling, right? From a product, from a, eng development perspective,
Yeah.
right? But haven't yet touched this side of, how managers lead. What would you, tell those types of leaders?
Yeah, I'd say we are still in early phase of determining like how we work with AI, but there are a few things that are already evident, which is I think this the pace at which we are all going to work is already sort of elevated, right? What we expect from one engineer or one product manager is already elevated, right? So, and there is, and we'll see sort of how it unfolds, but there's also sort of one view around we'll have flatter organizations where a manager will have a lot more people, who they'd be managing. I'm also seeing because the pace is so high and the context of not only the people you're managing is changing so fast, but as a manager, right, you need to have, it's like a context of multiple contexts, right? Like more the number of people you have, more sort of you really don't need to know their context. So I think having this kind of a tool where AI is assisting both the team members and the managers sort of fill in that gap, because there's a limit to sort of how far one single manager is going to scale, right? So both team members and managers, I think, need to have an assistant like this that can help them um, have a shared context, have more trust, because it's possible that the number of sort of engagements that people will have might be fewer, I don't know. And therefore you do need some sort of an assistant to keep the team going. And if we'll have um, a higher rate of sort of churn in the workforce, then it becomes even more important. Like if your workforce is churning faster, then the thread of culture will basically become weaker and weaker, because there's no time for you to set the culture, right? And like I still personally believe like culture will basically eventually trump um, you know um, execution and strategy as well. So if you want to build a long term organization, then I think a tool like this will really be helpful. So it's worth looking into on how it can actually fill that gap.
Yeah, I'm curious about the churn piece that you were mentioning and kind of employee turnover and retaining them. How do you kind of think about that today, and how do you kind of keep an eye on that as you're kind of in this growth context?
This is not like new, right? It's just it used to happen always. It's just that maybe the rate of that is probably going to uh, change. So whether it is, companies according to the business cycle have always sort of reduced workforce, then expanded workforce, and then reduced and then expanded, right? Um, so it's, again, I'm just sort of looking into the future. I don't know how right it's going to be, but we'll probably see shorter cycles where, so as leaders who are in an organization for long, right, like there might be faster cycles of people sort of coming in and going. So that's, I think, the main sort of context in which I would advise that you should see like how do you go in and ensure that your culture and your people strengths can still contribute to the success of your company and business.
Yeah, continuing to build the workforce even in rapid change.
Right.
Yeah, certainly resonates. So one last question then for you. Looking ahead, thinking about 2 or 3 years out, um, there's orgs like yourself, right, focused on manager development, the team development piece, right, and then others who may not focus and prioritize that. And what do you see that gap looking like? 2 to 3 years out, right? AI adoption will continue. There are a lot of changes, from here. But what does that kind of delta look like to you?
um so I think that the most obvious thing is um the hard skills. Like I think companies just really need to continuously invest in, and when I say hard skills, I mean like the core skill that is required for people to succeed. I mean, there's all sorts of conversations whether you'll go for people who are really really deep, or they are really really wide and they can actually wear multiple hats, etc. So um, I think that is going to be a differentiation. But then from the people side of it, I still firmly believe that like companies that have lasting and consistent ethos and value system, and who can actually bind their people together, uh, will more likely than not, show up ahead of other companies. Um, because ultimately, like you really need your people to make it work.
Yeah, that's so true. At the end of the day, it does all come down to people.
And we've said that software is a team sport, right? So until it remains a team sport, like the principles still remain, which is you need to have a great team. The team can be smaller, but still, it still is a group of sort of humans who are working together to produce an output and outcome that is much larger than the sum of the parts.
Yeah, that certainly resonates. Awesome. Well, Abhishek, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your perspectives, and we're really proud to work with you. And it's exciting to see how far your teams are coming, and excited to continue partnering with you here. So thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you for having me.